Welcome to the Zest for More podcast,
where we are all about finding joy in and beyond our jobs.
I'm Allison Wu.
I'm Gwen Osterbaum.
We are two former communications colleagues, friends, and two Columbia University graduate school alumni who have found ourselves asking a lot of the same questions.
Like, how do you dedicate yourself to one career path and then pivot when things change unexpectedly? And then in the midst of that change, find joy. Today, we're interviewing someone who has lived that life and is asking herself and others that same question.
Now, many of you may know Mellissa Fung as the co-author of this brand new book and New York Times bestseller, The Last Mandarin, which with renowned thriller writer Louise Penny. I know her as a very dear friend and one of the very kindest and smartest people I met at Columbia Journalism School. Mellissa is a highly accomplished journalist who built a stellar career covering global news for the Canadian Broadcasting Company. She was also a war correspondent and wrote about her harrowing experiences with Taliban in her first book, Under the Afghan Sky. She's also a huge champion for women and done documentaries on how African women have fought back against the Boko Haram. Last but not least, she's our first dame on this podcast, as she is a dame of the Canadian Order. Mellissa, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Allison and Gwen. It's so good to be with you.
It's so great to have a Columbia trifecta here. We're going to dig into your J School experience, which I know will pepper throughout this conversation, but I would love to just start, Mellissa, to learn a little bit more about what inspired you to become a journalist. And then if you can also talk about like how you decided to kind of hyper-focus, particularly around women's issues as you went around the globe.
I think it goes all the way back to when I was a new immigrant in Canada and didn't know the language, didn't know the history, and started watching the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the nightly news. And that's how I learned English, learned about my new country, and thought, wow, that sounds like a pretty good job, right? To go around telling stories. I've had that in my mind since I was very, very young. And so I think it's always just been a calling in a way.
And then when you got hired by the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, was that like a dream job? And when did you get to start doing the stories that you really loved around telling women's stories?
Well, I came to the women's stories. I think I always had, even as a local reporter in Vancouver. You know, there was a case of all these women going missing in the downtown east side in Vancouver. It turned out there was a serial killer, and a lot of these women were First Nations women. They were addicted to drugs. They were in the sex trade, and nobody took them seriously. You know, they were disappearing, but nobody really cared, including, the authorities. And so that was my first real experience about, telling stories of women who were sort of forgotten or, people didn't really care about. And so that carried on. And when I became a national reporter going to Afghanistan, that was the story that I really wanted to tell.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. Not a lot of female journalists choose to become war correspondents. What inspired that choice to be on the front lines of the story?
Partly, when Canadian military was involved in Afghanistan, all the networks would rotate reporters through because we had to have somebody on the base all the time, just in case something happened. And so I was part of that rotation, put my hand up, volunteered because, partly, our soldiers are serving there, right? So we need to be there, to be the witnesses. But also this whole idea that, the Taliban had so many restrictions on women when they were first in power. I just thought, how are the women coming out now? How are they coming out of that repression? They're getting educated. Girls are going to school again. And so there was a time where you saw a lot of progress. And I loved doing those stories because it sort of gave us like a reason to be there, right? As NATO. Those stories were really important to me, how women were making progress in terms of their rights and their education, and sort of like a touchstone on how the war is really going, right? Because the war on the battlefield, it could not be going well, but if women were still doing well, then it was worth keeping the fight.
Absolutely. Well, while there, you found yourself becoming part of the story, and you've had some very extreme and life-threatening experiences. How did you find most of the resiliency to transcend those experiences, and what was your path to recovery?
Well, obviously, there's post-traumatic stress involved after what happened. Just to make a long story short, I was taken hostage when I was at a refugee camp for the internally displaced in Kabul, outside of Kabul, and held hostage by militants for about 4 weeks in another province. But long story, I wrote the book about it, so I won't get into it. But I came back and I just really wanted to get back into the field. I wanted to go back and finish the story because as a journalist, you never want to be the story. And so the story I was going to go tell was about that camp and all the kids who were not in school because of the war. They were displaced. They're living in a camp with their parents. You know, their education has been interrupted. That was the story I'd gone to tell. And instead, I became the story. And so I spent many, many years trying to go back and finish telling that story. But I guess wasn't sure how to treat me. And so I was relegated to doing lots of entertainment stories. Not for a while. I was doing some investigative, longer form pieces, but they really didn't know what to do with me. All I wanted to do was go back and finish the story I was telling. So I eventually had to quit that job. And it was a job I loved, right? And I went back independently to finish telling that story. And that was, I thought by doing that, I was giving closure to my whole, post-traumatic stress syndrome, that I would be okay somehow after I, finished telling that story. But what I discovered was that was just the beginning of what I call my trauma journey. So I call it post-traumatic growth and not stress, because you've taken, like this happened to me and it changed the trajectory of my career, my life, and I can't sit and be upset about it, right? Like I have to use it for a reason. This happened for a reason. And so the reason, as it turns out, is that I have a platform to talk about Afghanistan and to talk about women in Afghanistan. So that's why I kept going back. I think after my incident, I was back there, 8 to 10 times until just before the Taliban took over in 2021.
That is a long time to keep investing in one place. Is the kind of experience and now like the culture and the people of Afghanistan that you wanted to showcase and elevate their stories, how does that affect the way you think about the business of journalism and your endeavor in continuing to tell stories?
See, I don't think of myself as a war correspondent at all. I mean, I was only, embedded with the military a few times. There were some harrowing situations. No, don't get me wrong. But I like to call myself a post-conflict journalist because I like to go in after the fact and see what has happened to especially women and kids, because that is your barometer for how the conflict has really affected the country, whatever country it is, right? When long after journalists have turned their attention to other conflicts, other wars, that's when, I like to go back and really be able to spend time. I think there's a place for that because there's so much going on in the world right now, right? That, you've got Iran, so we've forgotten about Ukraine, and there's just so much. And so for me, it was Afghanistan for a long time, right? I have to keep reminding us, Canada lost 153 soldiers there, right? They couldn't have died for nothing. And so, I really felt like I had a responsibility to keep telling that story.
When you're writing these stories, is the process of writing part of what keeps you going, or is there an element of, just going back to the podcast title, of do you find joy in the act of writing and capturing these stories and showcasing what people's lives are that would otherwise be, non-visible and no one would even know?
I think this is a good segue to The Last Mandarin, because everything I write about has been very hard. And so my first book about my memoir about being a hostage was very, very hard and triggering to write. And then I spent 5 years going back and forth to North northeastern Nigeria to tell the story of the survivors of Boko Haram. And that was very difficult to write because those girls had experienced something very similar to what I had. So that was also, triggering. And I was not finding joy. It was a responsibility. And I always, I don't shy away from that, right? It's, there's a responsibility for me to put a spotlight on these stories that, that the world has forgotten. And so, but it wasn't easy because there's no joy in telling stories about, sexual assault and gender-based violence. It's hard and it's triggering for me. So my dear friend Louise Penny realized this after my last book about the Boko Haram survivors and said, well, why don't we write a book together? It could be fiction. At first I thought, you're crazy. Like, why would you want to do that? But I think, part of it was she thought it would be fun and that I would have fun writing again. And that's exactly what happened. Like, who knew it would be fun to be able to make stuff up, kill people, with impunity, tell lies, right? Everything that I worked against as a journalist, I get to go crazy in fiction. So I did find joy in just kind of creating this world with Louise.
So let's talk about the book. So for those who don't know, who haven't read it, could you give us, the listeners, a quick synopsis of what the backdrop of the story is?
So the book opens and every single alarm in the world has gone off. Like, imagine, right? Your car alarm, fire alarm, smoke alarms. And the signal to do this has come from somewhere in China. And our two characters, a mother and daughter, are in a very special situation where they can actually help figure out what's going on. So they're called to the White House the mother is dissident. She was she was in Tiananmen Square at the protests back in 1989, and she went to America and has become this very famous dissident who speaks for democracy in China and all of this. And so they're in a very unique position to be able to solve what's going on and prevent the next attack.
So this is your first foray into fiction. What part of you took the journalism, nonfiction reporting part and kind of used it? Because you've got a lot of great global themes here, right? The rise of China as a mega power, technology, and how vulnerable we really are actually in the world. May not realize that. But what was, that like using not just left brain, right brain, but like journalism brain into fiction brain? How did that meld for you?
Well, I wish Louise was here because she would tell you that I had a really hard time making stuff up at first. Just an example, you've read the book where Alice, the daughter, has to go to Akron, Ohio, to do some asking around. And Louise and I would switch off. So she'd write a few chapters, pass it to me. And that was my, she'd like, okay, here. And the next chapter is Alice goes to Akron. Well, I've written 10 pages of Alice boarding the plane flying from New York or Washington to Akron. And then I think I mapped out the whole of Akron Airport and where the car rental was and, the route to this neighborhood. And so she said, oh my God, just get me from the airport to the house where she needs to be, right? So she took out all of that but I said, if somebody's living in Akron, they're going to want to know, and so little things like that. And then later on, there's a scene at the National Palace Museum in Taipei where Alice and Vivian have to go up the stairs. And I happened to be in Taipei and I counted the number of steps. Right. So I very proudly wrote in that they flew up 58 steps to the entrance. Well, Louise said, I don't care if it's 58 or 59. Right. That's a detail we don't really need because who is counting when they are in that panic? And I thought, okay, well, yeah, you've got a point there, And so it was really the journalist's brain, never really turned off. But in the end, it worked out because some things, really had to be accurate. especially the historical stuff, the Tiananmen stuff. There's a scene with the terracotta warriors, right? That had to be, you can't, some of the stuff you can't make up, stuff that everybody would know. You haven't really done your research. And so I was really diligent about that, she would say.
So is that what you brought to the table? If she was your sort of anti-fact person, what you were the person who said, no, I'm going to describe the Xi'an terracotta warriors accurately?
I think that's definitely, and I think she would agree, right? That, I was really kind of anal about details, but that's, as a journalist, you have to be. And what she brought the story, right? Otherwise, we'd have like 10 pages of, a tour of Akron.
Can I just go back and ask one question about how did you and Louise know each other? I am a huge fan of her series, and I notice another similarity to your coverage of the First Peoples, Native peoples in Canada, who many women who had violence committed against them, and it was untold. But she also did a story about that. And it was actually turned into a series, and it was a gripping storyline. And I was wondering did you guys meet through that, through your shared interest in those topics, or how did you?
We met in August 2021. I had just come back from Afghanistan, and of course the Taliban took over. And now I'm, in the middle of putting together my story. I'm getting panicked messages from Afghan women, like, help me, need to get out. And so I think I did not sleep for weeks, just was up all night trying to, get people to the airport, get them on planes, get them out of the country. And so Louise, out of the blue, called me because a mutual friend, that was the year that her book with Hillary Clinton came out. And so she and Hillary were together at that time. And as soon as this happened, I mean, if I was being inundated with messages from Afghan women, think about Hillary Clinton, right? So I think Hillary was really trying to, figure this out. And Louise really wasn't sure what she could do. And she wanted to help. And so a mutual friend of ours, former colleague of mine at the CBC, gave her my phone number. And she just called me and said, I want to help.
Wow.
And I said, oh my God, you're a godsend, because what she had were the resources. Frankly, I knew people, I could move people, but to do that, you need a lot of money, and you needed a lot of money at that time, especially to keep people, in Pakistan until they could go to a third country, right? Because you end up supporting whole families for like a year or more before they can move. And, I just couldn't, I was fundraising, but I couldn't do enough. And so she was really just, she managed to do all that. And it was incredible. So that's how we met. Mm-hmm.
How extraordinary.
And then we were living in London then, and she spends a lot of time there. So we actually finally met then. And then she became a regular at our Sunday dinner table.
Oh, I love that. And what was the actual process of writing? Did you guys at least have a skeleton and knew where the story was? Because you've mentioned you would each kind of turn off certain chunks of the book. But did you start with the skeleton? Did you map out, this is the trajectory, and then each one of you filled in the details?
We did and we didn't. I mean, I was following the leader, right? I've never written a novel before. And so I was just taking her lead. And we knew who our characters were. We knew where we wanted to go. So we knew the beginning and we knew the end, right? But the muddle in the middle, that, we had to kind of figure that out as we went. And I remember having lunch in London one day, and we have to talk about who really is the bad guy, right? It could be this person or this person or this person. I'm no, it can't be that person. And it can't be that person, and so, we really didn't know until, we were about more than halfway through writing it, who actually was causing all this chaos.
A lot of writers will say that there are moments where the book surprises them. Was that one of those moments, or were there others where you were like, I didn't know that was going to happen, or even the relationship between the mother and daughter, which is quite emotional and searing in and of itself, set within this broader geopolitical thriller?
I think that's what surprised us the most, how their relationship evolved. And we always knew it had to evolve because they can't stay stuck in that like very confrontational, where they keep missing and misunderstanding each other. You can't hold that for 80,000 words, right? And so we always knew they had to evolve. And it was nice to see that evolution. And maybe that wasn't the exact way we had thought about in the beginning, but in the end, I think it really worked. And we wanted it to be so nuanced, right, this book. So it would have been really easy to make the Chinese the bad guys. But they are, and halfway through, again, we're looking at the world and saying, well, actually, I feel safer going to China than America these days, right? Like and so we had to think and say, well, no, I mean, it's not so black and white, right? It's got to be in the gray. And that's, I think, where we land in the gray, because you see the president of China and the president of the US, they have a relationship, and they very much like Alice and Vivian, they come at it from like not really trusting the other, not really sure what the other's thinking, right? But then they actually have the same goal in the end. And so, that it's like these two relationships like sort of evolve as the story evolves.
Did you find that you were using any of your other journalism skills beyond the details and the specifics being correct? Like when you think about how you interviewed, I'm assuming you must have interviewed hundreds of people in your career. Does that help you get into the head of our American president in the novel and the Chinese head of the party? Did that?
Yeah, I don't.
You tell them?
I think in a way it did, but I was just really, it was so freeing to be able to just get inside their head, right? In a way that you wouldn't, I mean, and having interviewed, presidents before, and like, you just can't, like they give you a soundbite, right? They give you, and so to really be able to like write what they're thinking, right, is a real gift, because you get to, live inside somebody else's mind for a while.
What's the experience now, Mellissa, that it's had tremendous success? I mean, it's a New York Times bestseller. It's a number of bestsellers lists around the globe. How do you feel now that you've done that?
Under pressure to do something else, I think. It's been quite a wild ride, right? It's like nothing that I have ever experienced before. Being part of this big machine, this big publishing machine. And it's been really eye-opening in a lot of ways, and part of me thinks, oh, this is really exciting. Maybe you talked about pivoting, when you're in midlife or even later life now. I would think we're all of a certain age, right? And so I don't know what that pivot is, but I feel like I can't just abandon what I was doing before, like what I wanted to do before. So it's a matter of trying to figure out how best to tell stories, whose stories we should be telling next. And so, yeah.
Do you think you have more fiction in your future?
Maybe, and this is something Louise taught me too. Maybe sometimes fiction is a way to get at the truth more than nonfiction.
Well, I am a huge espouser of that point of view, so I love that Louise Penny said that as well. Just going back to the experience of being on the tour, and I know you're not necessarily visiting, sadly, our cities in the U.S. right now, but when you're going to other places or around Canada, can you tell us a little bit about what that process is like for this book? Like, do people share their, like, oh, I thought this was going to happen, or just what is it like to have a fan club when your co-author is Louise Penny?
I just sit back and watch, because, people want to ask her about Three Pines and what is happening in the village and, what's Gamache up to next, right? A lot of it is surrounding the Gamache series. And that's lovely to to witness her relationship with her readers. She's always so generous with them. So yeah, it's been a real experience, and she handles it with so much grace. And I don't know of many other authors of her stature who are that generous with their audiences.
Is it changing how you think about the craft of writing for yourself? I know you're saying you're still thinking about what might be next and whether a kind of nonfiction writing is part of what you might do next, but just are you enjoying that experience of having the direct access to readership, or is it something you're like, okay, take or leave?
I don't know. I think I would like to, I think I would like to try to write more fiction, but I think I also, need to find a way to, like we were talking before, telling those stories that still need to be told. And maybe there's a way to do it through fiction.
But you're also someone who's done this kind of work in so many different mediums, right? You're a TV person, you're a documentary person, you've written print, etc. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what your thoughts are about the current state of journalism, because we're in an interesting time now, right?
I left Daily News a long time ago just to do documentaries, and that was really, in a way, freeing as well, because you just had more time to think and give context. And I think, today it's really difficult to kind of sort through, all the noise to get to what is really happening. And then, of course, then there's the interference. Allison, you were talking about 60 Minutes. That's heartbreaking. Like, I don't know if you saw Scott Pelley's interview in the New York Times.
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Compelling. And,
Absolutely.
some people maybe thought he was too emotional or he was too... But I think what resonated with me was when he talked about the fact that, this is a calling, what we do. And we risk our lives. And some of us have lost our lives, and some of us have been really damaged doing this job, going to a war zone. And for that to not be respected by his superiors, that's really insulting. Because, you do this at great personal cost, some of the stuff we do. And to not have that respected I can't imagine. So I felt his pain. I really, really did.
I do think, though, one of the things that is a wonderful part of the technology we have today is that people like Scott and yourself and others can continue to have a voice and find an audience in very different ways. Look what Katie Cork has done on Substack. Look at how we have new voices emerging all over, right? Whether it's on YouTube or different areas. So I do think that the audience, we're in a huge shift, obviously, of the media structure. And I do think, though, good journalism will always find its audience and its place. It probably won't look like it has over the last 30 years, in the time that we have graduated. What is on your bedside table? What are you reading currently?
I am reading my good friend Lise Doucette's nonfiction, The Finest Hotel in Kabul, which is, and Lise, if you think I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, she's been going since, like before the Taliban took over in the first place. So, and her idea was to tell the recent history of Afghanistan through the eyes of the workers at Intercontinental Hotel on the hill in Kabul. And so it's brilliantly put together, just won the Women's Prize in Nonfiction. And so I'm just finished it now, and it's so sad that it ended.
Oh, I know that feeling. Well, this has been a great book and a great read, so thank you very much for writing it. Tell listeners where they can pick up the book or where they can catch up with you.
I am not hard to find. I'm on Instagram, Mellissa F. And the book, I think it's a book you can pick up anywhere, Barnes and Noble. I would highly recommend going to an independent bookstore, because we put together a special edition for the indie bookstores with an extra chapter at the end of the book. This is the independent bookstore cover. And this is the extra content.
Barnes and Noble. Right?
You don't have that one, Allison.
Yeah, this is
It's almost like it's like a mirror image is there. Yeah.
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 Like the reverse side. Wow, that's so cool.
So yeah. There's a letter in there from Louise and I to independent bookstores and their customers, and then the extra chapter.
what a good way to support another good cause. So yes, so many new models and new ways. Mellissa, thank you so much for being on the podcast and being our guest today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was joyful.
Awesome. It was for us too, and me especially. It was so lovely to meet you, Mellissa.
You too, Gwen. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mellissa, thanks so much. We'll be back in touch.
Bye.
All right, Gwen, it's on every day. You get to read, talk with the author who you're listening to their words and reading their words on a regular basis.
Well, at the same time, for sure, I'm at the beach right now, and I think this is a very good beach read.
Fantastic read. Absolutely, wherever you are. Because it's smart, and it's sexy, and it's interesting, and it's topical.
It's also a little bit quaint that the intrigue is in this kind of category where the president is someone that you thought you might have actually even thought of voting for. I could have asked her a ton of questions about getting into that headspace, but I liked what she said about having interviewed presidents and thinking about them and knowing that they are existing in sound bites, and that her job as a journalist was to get beyond that, and that in writing fiction she was able to get into their head and maybe even have a little sympathy for how they saw the world, which I think she does a really good job of doing in the novel, in the thriller.
Yeah, I really love the relationship of the mom and daughter, because in the backdrop of, superpowers and technology and how interconnected we were, it's even on that scale, you get to really see the inside, right? And the mother and daughter, just because the mother's famous and the daughter isn't, there's a lot of dynamic, but she's dealing with a lot of the same mother-daughter stuff, that everybody else is dealing with. And believe it or not, even though I'm a daughter, I felt quite compassionate for the mother. Actually, I think this daughter should give this mom a break. She's giving her a hard time, and maybe she should cut her some slack. So,
well, I definitely think that they explain the generational divide and that, first immigrant kind of reality of, you don't know what I lived through. You don't know how precious even being alive is. I think that also comes through in a way that any kid who's born in the U.S. in a kind of comfortable setting doesn't understand. And I wonder if Mellissa was also trying to get people to understand that difference of where you were born and when you were born shapes so much of how you experience everything that follows.
It's an interesting kind of track of how it comes together. Well, a great summer read.
Great summer read, especially everyone
pick it up, listen to
studying
it.
Mandarin. There's lots of Mandarin in there. So are you able to read the Mandarin, Allison?
My family was Cantonese, so father would have been able to, since he was multilingual, but nonetheless. But it's nice to hear. But it does make me, she's right, you know about the terracotta warriors. It makes me want to go to Duolingo and brush up on my Chinese lessons, which is also another good summer project anyway.
Oh yeah, my Duolingo. We should do a whole podcast on finding joy through Duolingo.
So that wraps it up for this episode. Don't forget that you can find all of our podcast episodes on YouTube at YouTube/Zest for More. You can also listen wherever podcasts are distributed, aka Apple and Spotify. And you can also go to Zest for More. All right, everybody, have a great week. Wynn, thanks so much.
Thank you, Allison.